In this video, you learn how to change the color and size of your text with CSS. To achieve that, you learn how to add CSS to your web page, what a CSS rule, selector, and declaration block are, how to set properties and 2 properties to change text, and also 5 different types of selectors. So let's get started. We've got this simple HTML page. Let's use CSS to change our paragraph's text color to green. I like the practical approach, so I'm going to write the code first, make it work, and then I'll explain it. First, I'm going to add the style HTML element. Inside, I'll write p space, curly braces, color, green. Save the file. Refresh the page. There you go. Now our paragraphs are green. Congratulations, this is your first CSS code. Now let me explain it. We write CSS code inside the style HTML element. It's one of the 3 main ways to add CSS to your web page. This is a CSS rule. It says find all the paragraphs on the page and make their text color green. A CSS rule has 2 parts. The first one is what elements we want to change, and the second one is what we want to change in those elements. The part where we say what elements to change is called a CSS selector. The part where we write the list of things we want to change is called a declaration block. Notice that I have all this formatting here. This space, this new line and spaces, this new line, this space too, they all are not required. But this is a good practice to have them like this to make our code more readable. But it's important that we put the selector first and then write all the properties we want to change in between the curly braces. A declaration block and a CSS selector together are a CSS rule. We can have as many CSS rules as we want. Let's add another one to make our header's text color blue. For that, I'm going to add a couple of new lines and write H2 to select all the header H2 elements. Space, curly braces, color, colon, royal blue, semicolon. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. They are royal blue. Great. Inside a declaration block, we can set as many properties as we want. To set a property, we write its name first, then colon, and then we put the value of that property and a semicolon. A semicolon says, we're done configuring this property, now it's possible to add another one. Let's do that and increase the text size of our headers. For that, I'm going to start from the new line and write font size, colon. What about 30 pixels, semicolon. This sets the height of our text in pixels. Refresh the page. There you go, our headers now are bigger. Here, I tell the browser to find all the H2 elements on the page and make their text color royal blue and font size 30 pixels. If I made a mistake in a CSS rule and skip a required part, for example, if I remove this semicolon, then the browser will ignore this particular rule with this mistake altogether, but it will apply all the other CSS rules, and it won't apply this specific rule that contains a mistake. Let me show you that. Save the file, refresh the page, and now our headers are back to their default styles. I'm going to return back the correct CSS code. There you go. This part of the CSS rule is called a selector. Modern CSS has more than 50 different types of selectors. This is a tag selector. To use it, we write an HTML tag name without angle brackets, and the browser finds on our page all the elements of that specific tag. So these two selectors, they are tag selectors. There is also the ID selector. So you probably know that we can have the ID attribute in any HTML element. Let me add ID company to this first header element. Remember, the most important feature of the ID attribute, it must be unique on a page. We can't have two elements with the ID company on the same page. We can set any value here as long as it's unique on that page and no other element has that ID. So let's add another CSS rule that makes this header with the company ID green too. To use the ID selector, we write hash and then the actual ID value. In our case, it's company. It's important that there are no spaces or other symbols between the hash and the actual ID value. Next goes a regular declaration block. So curly braces, color, colon, green, semicolon. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now this header is green. So with this selector, we tell the browser to find the element on the page that has the company ID value, and then change its color to green. Notice that we have two CSS rules that both are trying to set the text color of this header element. The first CSS rule is trying to set it to royal blue, and the second one is trying to set it to green. So now we have a conflict here. CSS has several approaches to resolve that conflict and determine what rule wins. Here wins the ID selector rule. Because the ID selector have more weight, they are more specific than tag selectors, and tag selectors are more generic, so they have less weight. So ID selectors always win over tag selectors when there is such a conflict. This is a good thing to remember because you'll have conflicting CSS rules quite often. Notice that these two CSS rules, they do the same thing. They change the text color to green, but to different HTML elements. So I'm going to copy this ID selector and add here a comma, paste the ID selector, and remove this CSS rule altogether. Save the file, refresh the page, nothing has changed. This means it works. This is called a selector list. It tells the browser to find all the paragraph elements and the element that has the company ID. And then the browser changes the text color to green for all those elements. We can add as many selectors to this list as we want. Just separate each selector with a comma. Great. The next useful selector is the class selector. It's arguably the most widely used CSS selector because it's convenient and flexible. So you probably know we can assign one or multiple classes to HTML elements. I'll add class royal blue to this paragraph and this paragraph. Now let's use CSS to change the text color to royal blue only for these two paragraphs. So I'm going to write period, royal blue, space, curly braces, color, royal blue. A class selector starts with a period, then goes the name of the class. It's royal blue in our case. It's important that there are no spaces or other symbols between the period and the actual class name. This class selector tells the browser to find all the elements with the royal blue class attribute and set their text color to royal blue. Let's see whether it works. Great, now their text is actually royal blue. Notice that now these two CSS rules set the text color to royal blue. Let's improve our CSS code and use the selector list. So, comma, h2, and I'm going to remove this declaration. Save the file, refresh the page, nothing has changed. This means it works. Remember about conflicts between rules in CSS. If I add this class to this header element and save the file, refresh the page, the text is still green because an ID selector is the strongest or the most specific. So it wins over the class selector too. So that is somewhat close to the rock, paper, scissors game. The tag selector is the weakest and always loses to the class selector. The class selector always wins over the tag selector, but always loses to the ID selector. And the ID selector is the strongest. Even a million tag selectors cannot defeat a single class selector. And even a million class selectors cannot beat a single ID selector. We can combine different types of selectors. At this moment, this header has the class royal blue, and so do these two paragraphs have the class royal blue. But let's say I want to increase the font size only for these two paragraphs that have the royal blue class, and do not change anything about this header. So for that, I can write a CSS selector that targets only the paragraph elements that have the class royal blue. Space, curly braces, and let's set their font size to 25 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now they are bigger. Notice that the font size of the tech company hasn't changed. This is because this selector tells the browser to find only the paragraphs that have royal blue class and set their font size to 25 pixels. So this header element, it has the class royal blue, but it's not a paragraph. So we write CSS inside the style tag. CSS code consists of one or more CSS rules. A single CSS rule has a selector and a declaration block. A CSS selector is where we tell the browser what elements we want to change. To use the tag selector, we write a tag name without angle brackets. ID selectors start with hash and are used to find a single element on the page with that ID. Class selectors start with a period and are used to find all the element of that class on the page. We can combine many selectors in a list with a comma. We can combine a tag selector with a class selector, and it's going to be a compound selector. A declaration block is a list of declarations. A single declaration is a property name, colon, and a value we want to change, and every declaration with a semicolon. And these were the very basics of CSS. If this video was helpful, subscribe to get more. Now check out this next video.